Hello everyone and welcome to Anyone Can Click, where we break down photography to its absolute basics, 1 week at a time. Today we will be deep diving and learning about the first tool of exposure triangle, which is going to help us control the amount of light that we want for our photograph, and that is aperture. We will also be solving 5 questions together, and I assure you that at the end of the 5th question, you will feel a lot more comfortable, a lot more confident with this topic. So now, without any further ado, let's begin. A super helpful on-field reference guide of today's session is linked in the description box below. Click to get your copy. However, I do recommend you watch the video till the end for the guide to make sense. In the last episode, we learned that light has to cross through 3 checkpoints before it reaches the processor that's going to turn it into a photograph. We also learned that it is important to ensure that we have the right amount of light. It is at these 3 checkpoints that we get to control the amount of light that we want for our photograph. The first checkpoint is located at the entrance of the lens, and this is aperture. So aperture is basically the window or the opening in the lens through which light enters the device for the very first time. Therefore, by being able to control the size of this opening, we get to decide how much light we want for our photograph. More the aperture, more the light. Smaller the aperture, lesser the light. What we've basically done is we've understood how aperture plays a role in controlling exposure. So let's understand this a little bit better with the help of these examples. Now this image was taken at a particular aperture size. I'm going to change the size of the aperture, and I would like you to observe the impact this has on the exposure of the photograph. I'm also going to keep all my other settings constant, so whatever change we see can be ascribed to the aperture size alone. Now notice, as the size of the aperture decreases, the image is getting progressively darker. This is because less and less light is now entering the lens. This is how aperture can be used to control the amount of light. Now this is where things get a little more interesting. In the last episode, we saw how the tools of the exposure triangle affect exposure, but they also have a certain qualitative effect on the photograph. This is why so many photographs which have the same exposure can still look very different from one another. So what is this qualitative impact that aperture has on the photograph? Let's find out. Now in these 2 examples, I have kept the amount of light constant. But the difference is, in the first image, I have kept the aperture wide open, while in the second image, the aperture size is quite small. Now let's take a closer look at both of these images and see how they differ in a qualitative aspect. Now in the first image, it is obvious that the star of the photograph is the subject. The entire focus is on the subject, and the background is just an out of focus, blurred feature of the image. Now these are the kind of photographs that we crave when we want to click portraits of people, pets, etc. Now coming to image number 2. Now in this image, one glance will tell you that there is so much more detail. It's essentially the same scene, and yet you can begin to appreciate the details in the background. In other words, more of this image is in focus. And this feature of a blurred background and the amount of photograph that is in focus is what we call depth of field. Depth of field in and of itself is a very important topic, and we will be covering that in great detail in episode number 11. This is because in addition to aperture, there are some other factors which affect the depth of field. And we will revisit aperture and its effect on depth of field once again in that video. This example was just to give you a flavor of how aperture can affect the qualitative aspect of a photograph. Now that we have understood aperture and we've seen how it impacts the qualitative aspects of the photograph, the exposure of the photograph, the depth in the photograph, let's move on to the next segment where we will understand how do we express aperture and where do we find it. Now, because aperture is basically the size of the opening of the lens, we would naturally expect it to be denoted in the form of millimeters or centimeters. But there is an inherent problem with this approach. Imagine if I were to tell you that the profit of a company is 10 crores. This alone is inadequate information because 10 crores to a multinational company could mean something very different as compared to the same 10 crores for a startup. This is the exact same problem that we have with aperture. Saying that the aperture is 30 millimeters, 70 millimeters is actually inadequate information. This is because aperture is tightly linked to one other factor of the lens, and this is focal length. We will cover focal length in a different video where we will also cover the types of camera bodies, the types of sensors, lenses, etc. For now, let's just think of focal length as the degree of zoom. This means that a 50 mm aperture size will have a very different effect on a 20 millimeter lens, on a 300 millimeter lens, and on a 500 millimeter lens. This is why it's very important that when we speak about the aperture size, in the same breath, we also speak about the focal length of the lens. And the best way to do that is by putting them both together into one ratio. And this ratio is called the f-stop number. This is how we denote the aperture size in the camera. Now the f-stop number can be found on your LCD screens somewhere like this. So now let's understand, how does this f-stop number relate to the size of the aperture? What does it mean when we say that an aperture size is f4 or it's an f16? Now this is where it can get a little bit tricky, but I have a trick for that as well. Basically, an inverse relationship exists between the size of the aperture and the f-stop number. Smaller the f-stop number, bigger is the size of the aperture, and bigger the f-stop number, smaller is the size of the aperture. In the beginning days of my photography, I would constantly get confused with this relationship. So I would think to myself, when it comes to aperture, less is more. Lesser the f-stop number, more the size of the aperture, more is the light. More the f-stop number, lesser the size of the aperture, and lesser is the light. It's going to take a little bit more practice, but then it almost becomes like second nature. If all of this is starting to seem a little confusing, do not worry. We are now going to take a couple of minutes, put everything that we've learned together, and we're going to solve 5 examples. Before we begin solving these examples, there are 2 things that I would like you to keep in mind. The first one is always determine the size of the aperture from the information that's provided. Remember, less is more. Lesser the size, more is the f-stop number. Once you've done this, then you can proceed with the following formula. More the aperture, more the light, more the background blur. Smaller the aperture, lesser the light, lesser the background blur. So question number 1. In which of these 2 images was the aperture size bigger? Going back to our formula, more the aperture size, more is the light, more is the background blur. And hence, of these 2 images, this is the correct answer because this is where the background is more blurred. Another way to say this is that less of the image is in focus. Such kind of images are said to have a shallow depth of field. Question number 2. One of these images was clicked at f3.8 and the other at f20. Which image was clicked at f20? Now let's first determine the size of the aperture. Less is more, which means more the f-stop number, smaller is the size. And hence f20 corresponds to a small aperture size. Now we can easily apply formula number 2. Smaller the aperture, lesser the light, lesser the background blur. Of these 2 images, this image is the correct answer because this one has less background blur. Another way to put it is that more of this image is in focus. Such kind of images are said to have a deep depth of field. Question number 3. In which of these images more light was let in through the aperture? Now, more light always enters through a wider aperture. So we need to find out which of these images has a bigger aperture size. Again, we go back to formula number 2. More the aperture size, more is the background blur, more is the light. Of these two images, this one has more background blur and hence this is the correct answer. Question number 4. What do you think was the f-stop number of this photo? f4 or f32? Assuming that the aperture is the main factor in the image controlling the depth of field. Now, again, let's address this question in terms of the size of the aperture. In this image, the background seems to be in focus, which means it has less background blur, which means it has a smaller aperture size. And smaller aperture size means a bigger f-stop number, and hence the answer would be f32. Now that we've understood the concept of aperture, we've reached the last segment of this video where we will cover 3 important terminologies when it comes to aperture. The first is wide open. When someone says that they are shooting wide open, it means that they have set their aperture to the maximum possible size that the lens can offer, which also means that the f-stop number is at the most minimum. In fact, the name of the lens itself will tell you what is that maximum aperture size and at what f-stop you will get it. For instance, this lens here is a 300mm f4, which means that my maximum aperture size that this lens can give me is at an f-stop number of f4. The second terminology is stopping down. Now, stopping down means that we are closing the aperture. We are decreasing the size of the aperture, which means that we are increasing our f-stop number. So when I change my aperture from an f4 to an f5.6 or an f8, it means that I'm stopping down. Just as every lens has a maximum aperture size, it also has a minimum aperture size. This is a little more hard to find, but a simple Google search will help you with that. This brings me to a very, very important point. Always use very high f-stop numbers with caution. This is because when we make our aperture too small, it starts to impact the photo negatively because of diffraction. Now this brings me to the third and the most important terminology, and that is sweet spot. Every lens has a sweet spot, which is basically a range of f-stop numbers where the lens will perform the best in terms of optical clarity and sharpness. Now this does not mean that you cannot use f-stop numbers outside this range, but when the conditions are right, when there is adequate amount of light, it always helps to photograph within that range. A simple Google search will tell you what the sweet spot of your lens is, but it is also a good practice to determine that sweet spot on your own by conducting some tests. I will be making a separate video on that. There are some finer nuances about aperture which we will cover at a later point. This is the matrix approach to learning photography, where we will cover the most fundamental aspects of the most fundamental topics first, and then as we get more and more comfortable with the subject, with our gear, then we will revisit the same topics and cover the more complex, the more finer aspects of it. If you have found this video of value, please do like, subscribe and comment. I do not really understand too much about the algorithms, but I know this will greatly help the channel. In the next episode, we will cover the second tool of exposure triangle, and that is shutter speed. Until then, take care. Goodbye.